Throughout the presentation, we will refer to domestic tourism. By this we mean visitors from Great Britain and Northern Ireland, although some slides will refer to GB and others to UK, depending on the source of the data that's been used. Visitors from Northern Ireland make up around 1% of all visits, so both GB and UK data can be viewed as representative of the domestic market. There's no significant difference between the two. Firstly, a bit of context for tourism performance globally and in Scotland. Globally, international arrivals reached 99% of 2019, so pre-COVID levels in 2024, following a period of recovery as travel behaviours normalised after the pandemic. Scotland was ahead of the curve there and saw international visit levels recover in 2023, and were leading other GB nations in experiencing continued growth of international tourism in 2024. However, as many of you are aware, the staycation boom seen between 2021 and 2022 has not been maintained, and Scotland is seeing reduced levels of domestic tourism in 2023 and 2024. Why is the domestic market important for Scotland as a tourism destination? The domestic market is Scotland's single largest market by volume of visits, making up over 75% of all visits to Scotland. In 2024, that was a total of 6 million Scottish resident domestic overnight trips and a further 4.5 million from the rest of Great Britain. The domestic market supports tourism year-round and is a key market to drive growth out of season, driven by winter breaks in Q4 of 2024 particularly. 51% of domestic trips were taken outside what's traditionally seen as the peak season of Q2 and Q3. Increased familiarity with Scotland's geography and our product offering. Scotland's domestic visitors also travel more broadly across Scotland's regions, with 4 in 5 trips being to destinations outside of Edinburgh. And visiting friends and relatives in Scotland is also a driving purpose of many trips in Scotland, contributing to the spread of economic benefit of tourism across the country. So what about the challenges posed by the domestic market? The one at the forefront for most in tourism at the moment is the decline in domestic visitor numbers in recent years. The staycation surge driven by pent-up demand for holidays in 2021 and 2022 has not been sustained, with a 21% decline in domestic overnight visits from 2022 to 2024. The cost of living crisis and attitudes to leisure spending has also contributed to a 25% decline in total nights spent in Scotland by domestic visitors, with a reduction in length of stay being seen as one way to limit expenditure as part of a trip. Booking behaviours can also make engaging with the domestic audience challenging. Domestic visitors plan and book within tighter timeframes than international visitors, and are more likely to not book trip elements such as activities, which can limit opportunities for engagement in advance of a trip. And Jackie will look at this more closely during the session, looking at planning and booking behaviour. The pent-up demand for travel following the pandemic is also true for Scots travelling abroad, and competition for visitors' attention and constrained budgets is fierce, with 5.6 million Scots travelling overseas in 2023 and a further 4 million visiting other GB destinations each year. When compared with 2023, the volume of domestic trips has reduced by 14% and nights has reduced by 17%, whereas spend has increased slightly, up 5%. The average duration of trips taken by domestic visitors in 2024 was 2.8 nights, slightly shorter than in 2023, but with a higher average spend per night of £113 and spend per trip of £315. Scotland experienced a shift in domestic profile in 2024, with reductions in trip volume by younger independents and family life stages, and an increase in those from older age groups. As highlighted earlier, 51% of domestic trips in 2024 were taken in Q1 and Q4, although those trips tend to be shorter and therefore lower spend than those taken in peak season, particularly Q3, which sees the highest spend per trip and the longest length of stay of all quarters. Unusually, the volume of domestic overnight trips in 2024 steadily increased, peaking in the final quarter with 3.2 million trips in Q4. Nights and spend, however, both peaked in Q3, aligning with the traditional seasonal pattern of tourism. Domestic visitors travel for a variety of reasons, with the main purpose of trip seen in 2024 being both holiday and visiting friends and relatives. Those holidaying in Scotland stay longer and spend more than visiting friends and relative visitors on average staying 3.5 nights per trip and spending £392 across that stay. Visiting friends and relative visitors have lower spend per day, lower spend per trip due to limited engagement with accommodation. Although evidence from early 2025 suggests that some visiting friends and relatives and holiday hybrid trips are increasing in popularity, which does offer opportunities to drive growth in visits and spend from those visiting residents of Scotland. I'll now hand you over to Jackie for a closer look at the motivations and behaviours of domestic visitors. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. So Leslie has outlined how important the UK market is to Scotland, and we're now going to look at the reasons why UK visitors choose to take holidays and short breaks here, alongside their planning and booking behaviours. Domestic visitors are different to international ones in that they tend to have greater knowledge and familiarity with the country. Our recent visitor survey showed that only 10% of domestic visitors to Scotland were first-timers, with more than a third being very regular visitors. And this rises to around 7 in 10 Scots who take frequent trips in Scotland. The primary motivator is still scenery and landscape, but as Leslie mentioned, there are a high proportion of UK visitors visiting friends and family in Scotland, and obviously for many, the closeness to home is another reason for choosing Scotland. When we look at the domestic drivers for taking a holiday, the connection with nature shines through, together with quality time with loved ones. Of course, attending a special occasion such as a graduation or a wedding is also an opportunity for a short break, as well as those who come with more niche interests such as cyclists, climbers, walkers, etc. Family history and ancestry is a much lower driver for UK visitors compared to longer haul markets, but individuals still can do that as an activity. So those were the drivers behind the need for a holiday. Then when we asked visitors what reason they had for choosing Scotland for their trip, scenery and landscape and history and culture came out as top. Now for visitors from south of the border, they are more likely to say history and culture as a reason, with Scots themselves tending to pick scenery and landscape as the primary driver. But we can also see more niche reasons for breaks, such as choosing a destination hotel or somewhere with great food, which is particularly popular with Scots. Let's now have a look at what domestic visitors do on a trip to Scotland. The first thing to say is that UK visitors are less likely to visit attractions than our international visitors. They still do visit attractions, but just not to the same extent. They tend to do quite a wide range of activities when they're here. And as you can see, viewing architecture and buildings, doing some element of shopping, whether it's specialty shopping or something else, or something like walking, watching wildlife, or going out on a boat trip, tend to be the top activities people do. For Scots, they are more likely to do water sports and paddle sports and cycling than the rest of the UK visitors. Let's now have a look at the planning and booking behaviours of our domestic visitors. The first thing to say is that a quarter of UK visitors don't look for information for planning prior to their trip. These visitors are more likely to be repeat visitors to Scotland and are also more likely to be staying in one location rather than touring around Scotland or staying in multiple places. 75% of UK visitors started researching and planning their trip to Scotland within 6 months, with 1/3 doing so 3 to 6 months in advance. Scottish residents are much more likely to plan within a month of travel than visitors from the rest of the UK, probably because of their greater knowledge of the country. The bigger the travel group, then the earlier the planning process starts. Solo travellers, however, were much more likely to start the planning process within a month of travel, faster than any other traveller type. Those who stayed longer also tend to plan holidays earlier. Amongst those who spent more than 7 nights in Scotland, 38% planned their trip at least half a year in advance, and only 6% planned within a month of travel. The planning of the trip and the actual booking tended to happen very close together for UK visitors, less than a 4-week gap, which is a much shorter time period than it is for our international visitors. For those who looked for information to research and plan their trip, 31% used a type of travel intermediary, normally an online travel agent such as Expedia, Booking.com, etc., before they actually booked anything. However, a large proportion, 64%, did directly book with the accommodation provider. Again, probably because the level of familiarity and knowledge is greater for UK visitors. Finally, when it comes to booking activities and experience, only 29% of UK visitors booked these in advance of their trip. Now, this might partly be due to the fact that a lot of activities these visitors are doing are free to plan. You don't need to plan for going for a long walk or a hike, for example. But those who did book in advance, if they were going to an attraction or an experience that did need booked, the vast majority did so directly with the activity or experience provider. This is a much lower proportion of booking in advance for activities than it is for international visitors. Since May 2020, Visit Scotland, Visit England and Visit Wales have collaboratively run a sentiment and intentions tracker. The initial focus was around the effects of the pandemic, but then we swiftly moved on to looking at the cost of living crisis and the effect of domestic holidays and short breaks. So what are the key takeouts for the upcoming summer period for UK consumers? Almost 7 in 10 are planning a domestic break over the summer, and this is a very similar proportion to the same period last year, with 44% already having booked their trip. This is actually up on the same period last year when it was 41%. 13% are planning a trip in Scotland, and Scotland is the second joint most preferred UK region to visit alongside Wales and behind the southwest of England. However, there are still people who are not taking trips or have cut back on their trips in the last 6 months, and these barriers remain financial, with the cost of accommodation being the main reason for not doing so. For those that are still planning on taking trips, there's definite evidence that they're still going to alter their domestic trips by doing or spending less, by changing accommodation type, spending less on food and drink, less on attractions, or just changing their plans, maybe taking smaller holidays or travelling outside peak times. Hotel, motel and inn was the number one accommodation type, so serviced accommodation was still the top accommodation type. But we've noticed compared to last year that this has fallen, and there have been increases in those planning to stay in self-catering accommodation or with friends and family due to those financial barriers. In summary then, what we've seen is the sentiment around the cost of living has stabilised over the past year, and the effects on actual holiday taking is lessening compared to the same period last year. Consumers are getting used to the new cost of living crisis. UK residents' trip intentions are stable across the summer, and there is strong commitment to take those trips, as we've seen with the booking proportions. And intentions to visit Scotland are also strong, but they're not as strong as they are in the rest of the UK. We've also seen evidence that consumers are still looking to cut back on their spend, regardless of where they're taking their trip in the UK. But Scotland trips tend to be more vulnerable than those in the rest of the UK. Even though the commitment levels are still high, they're lower than they are for other UK regions, and our booking levels are also lower than other UK regions. So let's just summarise a few of these points. We've looked at the drivers for UK visitors coming to Scotland and what motivates them to come here. And we've seen that it's things like landscapes and nature, history and culture, the wide variety of outdoor activities that we have, as well as a high proportion visiting friends and family, and for Scots in particular, the proximity of having such a wonderful country on their doorstep. We've also looked at the activities that they tend to do when they're here. So for businesses listening to this webinar, it's about thinking about how your current product covers some of these topics. Are you able to create something new to deliver in some of these areas, or could you expand your current product? There may be an opportunity to partner with another business. Give yourselves a bigger voice and be able to launch a bespoke and immersive experience to attract these visitors. Finally, when we're thinking about planning and booking and when you're marketing your business, you should market further in advance to visitors from the rest of the UK outside of Scotland, those looking for a longer stay, perhaps of 7 nights or more, larger groups who tend to plan and book much earlier, and families who also plan and book much earlier. However, there are opportunities to offer last-minute deals on shorter stays to Scottish residents who are much more spontaneous, solo travellers, and small groups of friends.